I'm just going to be walking us through what the UPR is, a little bit about what the UPR cycle is, and what the objectives of the UPR are, and also what the basis of the review is, before we move on to way more exciting bits of UPR engagement. So just to start us off, the Sexual Rights Initiative, which is an organization I work with, and Action Canada and Akahata are partners of, is a feminist North-South coalition, and we work together to advance human rights related to sexuality, gender, and reproduction using a feminist lens throughout the United Nations Geneva-based human rights system. With regards to our UPR engagement, our focus is on collaborating with national organizations and coalitions to prepare, submit, and advocate on sexual rights situations and issues in their countries, through the submission of stakeholder reports and through sustained engagement over the entirety of the UPR cycle. So this includes working later on statements, but also lobbying with states directly on recommendations. We also engage in research and analysis on how sexual rights, and we use sexual rights quite broadly, so sexual and reproductive health and rights, and other interesting little rights niche bits on how they are faring in the international human rights system. We also work to strengthen the capacities of all CSO activists and CSO engagement, to ensure that we have a broad range of CSOs that are able to engage with the UPR with or without our technical support. And we also work to produce tools on the UPR, including our UPR database, which we'll link to a little bit later on in the slides. And we also engage with states to encourage them strongly to continue to invest their time, their energy, and their resources into the UPR so that we can sustain the mechanism and have it ongoing, hopefully, for the next few decades. Next slide, please. So what are the objectives of the UPR? So the paramount objective of the UPR is to ensure that there is an improvement of the human rights situation at the national level. And the way that the UPR aims to do this is to monitor whether or not states are meeting their human rights obligations and commitments by assessing the positive developments on the ground, and also hearing from states what sorts of challenges they might be facing in meeting their obligations. There's also a component of the review that's concerned with ensuring that the states have the capacity they require and technical assistance, both from the Office of the High Commission on Human Rights, but also from other states, in consultation with and the consent of the state that's involved. It's also an opportunity for states to share their best practices in meeting their obligations and to hear best practices from other stakeholders. It is also a platform for increased cooperation among states in the promotion and protection of human rights, and to encourage states to fully cooperate and engage with the Human Rights Council and other human rights bodies within the UN system and the Office of the High Commission on Human Rights. Next slide, please. So the UPR was established in 2006 to improve the human rights situation in all countries. And it's a unique mechanism in that all of the member states in the world have a chance to review all other member states on whether or not they are meeting the human rights obligations. And the UPR operates on a cyclical basis. So each country will be reviewed every 4.5 years, sometimes 5-ish. And the UPR is designed to highlight the actions that each country needs to take in order for them to fulfill their agreed human rights obligations. And these actions will be presented to the country under review as recommendations, which the country under review can either accept or note. So when countries don't accept recommendations, we call it noting. So it's supposed to be pretty black and white in that sense. No sort of yes, no, I like these bits, but not those other ones. Next slide, please. So this is just a visual representation of the different stages of what we call the UPR cycle. There are 4 phases to the cycle. The preparation phase, which is the phase that we're currently in with regards to Canada's reporting, which is when civil society is preparing its stakeholder reports. At the same time, there should be a parallel process where the Canadian government will now be working on their own reports. And at the same time, all of the countries that will be reviewing Canada are also starting to find out information on the context in Canada so that they can prepare their recommendations that they'll make to Canada. The second phase is the review phase. So this is the phase that takes place in Geneva, where the Canadian government will present its report on how it's been meeting its obligations over the last 4 years, and where it will receive the initial recommendation from other states. And then we'll come into the third phase, which is where there's the outcome report. So the official record of what happened, where all the states agree that, yes, this is what I said, these are the recommendations I made. And this third stage is when we find out from Canada which recommendations that it received it will accept and which it will note. And then the fourth and final phase is the implementation phase, which, even though it looks the tiniest in this graphic, is actually the longest phase, which is when Canada actually has the obligation to implement on those recommendations that it said it's accepted. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about this cycle, there are two places where NGOs can naturally intervene. So the first place that NGOs can naturally intervene is in that first preparation phase through the creation of a stakeholder submission. And then the second part, where NGOs can naturally intervene, is in the third stage, at the outcome and adoption stage, where NGOs can make a statement make a statement on the state statement. So at the adoption phase, the states will make a statement where it's like, okay, these are the recommendations we got. These are the ones that we're picking because we think they're shinier than the other recommendations. And basically, this is how we feel about it. And then NGOs have the opportunity to tell states how we feel about their feelings about the recommendations. And sometimes those feelings are positive. Sometimes we're happy and we're welcoming the recommendations the state has accepted and committing ourselves to help the state implementing them. Sometimes we're telling the state that it really needs to take certain rights more seriously or should make certain kinds of voluntary commitments. So those are the two obvious places where you expect NGOs and CSOs to be able to participate. But there are other ways of influencing the outcome or achieving impact. So with the Sexual Rights Initiative, we do invest a lot of time and effort into approaching states directly to try to influence their recommendations that they're making to the states under review. So we will, as we are working on the stakeholder reports for Canada, we will then approach other countries to say, look, this is our stakeholder report, this is our summary, these are the recommendations that we think Canada really should receive. Please make these recommendations for us. So that is something that other NGOs and CSOs would also consider doing in their stakeholder reporting. Next slide, please. So in that second phase, that review phase, the review is going to be based off of 3 documents. So the first document that's considered is the national report. So this is the report that the government of Canada will have prepared. And it will be initially a written report that's submitted to the Office of the High Commission on Human Rights that will then be made available to all of the other member states. But they will also provide an oral report during their review session, where they will basically outline what is in their report, how it's been going, and what their priorities are. They will congratulate themselves on the really good work that they have done. They might skirt over some of their challenges, but it's to be expected because every country wants to look and sound good. So on the next 3 slides, you'll see that I have links to previous versions of the documents for everybody to be able to have a look at later on in both the English and the French. Next slide, please. The second document that is considered or that's used as the basis of the review is the UN Summary Report or the Compilation Report. What this report is basically the summary of all kinds of recommendations that Canada will have received from other UN spaces, so treaty monitoring bodies, from UN agencies. All that kind of information and data will be summarized in these 10 pages. So it's partly for this reason that in our CSO stakeholder summaries, we don't need to bring up so much information that has come out of the UN system, because there will be a separate specific document that has all of this information summarized for the states to engage with. Next slide, please. And then the third document is where civil society really gets to shine, and it's the stakeholder summary report. So you know that all of the CSOs will have made their submissions. They'll either do an individual submission, which is about 2,800 words, or they'll work on a joint submission, which is 5,600-ish words, and they'll have written all of their very important things, the analysis and the recommendations. And then what happens is that after we have submitted them, the Office of the High Commission then has to look at all of the stakeholder reports that it has received, and it creates a summary of those reports. It will select different bits of the different reports, different bits of information, and say, with regards to the right to health, for example, this is the kind of data that came out of the summary reports. These are some of the things that have been said by different CSOs. And so even if we don't manage to do outreach with many states with our stakeholder reports, there is a chance that the stakeholder reports will be included in the summary report, and in that way it will have broader reach than we would be able to do by ourselves, essentially. And just to go a little bit more in depth into the stakeholder reports. So as I said, there are two kinds of submissions. One is the individual submission. This can be literally made by an individual activist, or it can mean like an individual organization. The word limit for this kind of submission is 2,815 words. The other kind of submission is a joint submission. These are reports that have been made by a coalition of stakeholders or organizations. There is a larger word count for this, 5,630 words. Joint submissions are generally encouraged when stakeholders focus on issues of a similar nature. It being a joint submission is regarded with a little more legitimacy. It suggests that the analysis that you're providing or the information that you're providing is credible, and that the recommendations that you are suggesting have a bit more buy-in. So they are encouraged. It should be noted that if you are considering working on a stakeholder submission, that the UPR mechanism by itself does not provide for confidentiality. This means that when you're making a submission, there will be names of organizations and contact information on the submissions themselves. And these submissions also become public documents, especially if they're included in the stakeholder summary reports. They will be widely available on the OHCHR's website online. And so if you are working or collaborating with people who may not want for their information to be public, that is definitely something to be keeping in mind. So just thinking around, so what we have done, for example, at the Sexual Rights Initiative, when we had activists who wanted to be anonymous, is that we would do a joint submission and put the SRI's name on it and our contact information, and then indicate that there was an anonymous activist who also worked on it, for example. Next slide, please. So those are all of so we've just spoken of all the documents that are the basis of the review, but now we're just gonna talk a little bit of the documents that come out of the review. So the first thing that will come out of the review, a few days after the review has taken place, is the advanced unedited version of the report of the working group. This is literally just like the initial rapid sword version. Like they were sitting, typing away while the presentations were being made and whilst people were asking questions. And in this version is where member states will also say whether or not their recommendations have been correctly reflected, or if there's anything else that needs adjusting. And then later on, we'll get the actual official report of the working groups that will come out in tandem with the third stage of our cycle. At this stage, we'll also receive the addendum to the report of the working group. And what this is the state under review's responses to recommendations received. So it is in this document that Canada will say, so we received XYZ recommendations and we accept them or we note them. And in this addendum, a country can also say if they're making any voluntary commitments. So this happens where perhaps there's a priority issue that the country really wanted to work on, and it turns out they haven't received any recommendations on this topic. but they still want to make the commitment to work on it in the next 4.5, 5 years. And they'll also say, we are going to work on access, like the right to water, for example. The third thing that also comes out is the decision on the outcome and adoption of the outcome report. So the entire adoption process takes place during the Human Rights Council session. So state phases one happens before the session, and then phase 2 happens in the working group session, which is especially for the UPRs, it's the UPR working group session. But phase 3 takes place at the same time as the Human Rights Council session. And so in this Human Rights Council session, there will be a decision to adopt the outcome. So to adopt the official working group report and to adopt the addendum and the report of the addendum that the state will have given. And so there's like a 1-page decision saying that's what they have done. So those are the documents that must come out of every review. And then there's some other documents that also just happen to come out. One is a letter by the High Commissioner on Human Rights to the foreign minister of the country that's being reviewed. And then this letter, the High Commissioner will outline some of the issues that came out of the UPR review that the High Commissioner finds to be particularly key. This is an arbitrary designation of what is key, depending on what the High Commissioner feels like or prioritizes. And another thing that can come out of each review is the matrix of recommendations, which is essentially a work plan on how they're going to implement those recommendations that they have received. Next slide, please. So where are we with the UPR mechanism right now? We're just about to start the 4th cycle of the UPR in November. And the focus of this 4th cycle will be on whether or not states have been actually implementing past recommendations that have been accepted, and on also identifying and attempting to address any emerging human rights situations and issues. A way that I like to think of the UPR is that it's an M&E exercise for states, essentially. It's a monitoring and evaluation exercise, and the program that they are evaluating and monitoring is human rights. And so we've discussed already the 2 key entry points for CSOs, but I will say that as a CSO, your main goal, your number 1 goal in your stakeholder submission also, and in your adoption statementing, well, really mostly in your stakeholder reporting, is to have other countries bring up the recommendations that you recommend to your country under review. So you're trying to get other countries to tell Canada what to do, and you want them to tell Canada your ideas, okay? You don't want them to just have they can have their own ideas, but it'd be better if they were yours. That is your goal, if you choose to accept it. So since the first session, generally we have seen that SRHR themes have done fairly well. There have been more than 28,000 recommendations on these themes made, of which 76% of them have been accepted. As we're going into the 4th cycle, our goal is that we would like for there to be more, like a wider breadth of SRHR issues covered, and for those issues that are covered, to have greater depth in those recommendations, to ensure that the recommendations that are being made are consistent with what activists find useful at a national level. Next slide, please. So how's the UPR different to other mechanisms? What makes the UPR unique when you're comparing it with treaty monitoring bodies is that in the UPR, states are being monitored by other states as opposed to an expert committee, for example, in CDOR or CRPD. In some ways, this increases the perception of legitimacy of the UPR because states feel that only other states know how hard it is to be a state, yay? And then there's a component of it that then deals with reputation. States don't want to be embarrassed or shamed in front of other countries. But it also means that any kinds of geopolitical tensions that are existing between states or that are existing in other multilateral spaces will also be reflected in this space. There's kind of no getting away from that. What we have seen is that sometimes states will take more seriously recommendations that they have received in other parts of the UN system, if that recommendation is made to them in the UPR by another state. Another pretty cool thing about the UPR is that you can use it to speak about or to draw attention to any kind of human rights issue, right? Whereas with the treaty monitoring bodies, you're really restricted to an analysis that is based on the treaty provisions. And states also need to be a party to those treaties in order for them to be reviewed under it. But with the UPR, all states can be reviewed on anything and given recommendations on any kind of human rights issue. Also, the stakeholder reports themselves don't have to be very detailed or very complicated. Indeed, they're not very long. Something that's also different is that with TMBs, there's a lot more time for the review. It's a more inquisitorial process. They're trying to draw out more information and data. Whereas with the UPR, it is only half a day that they have to really engage the state in this report. Another plus for the UPR is that states want to keep it. They like having it. They think it's a great way to be able to hold each other accountable for their human rights obligations. They think it helps to reinforce the universality of rights, and also ensuring that people think about that review as kind of a mundane and a consistent thing, as opposed to something that should happen at times of crisis. So you're not being scrutinized for human rights because something really, really terrible has happened. And the UPR is really, really focused just on that implementation. Like what have you done for human rights lately, essentially. Next slide. So we really touched on some of these strengths. I'll just pick on a few. It's also comparatively easy to have recommendations raised, if only because there are so many more countries than there are committee members. Really, like 194 countries are participating in the UPR. There's likely to be someone who could be interested in your issue and is willing to say something about it. Another thing is that the UPR is transparent. It's easy to hear what the different states are saying on issues, the kind of recommendations they're making, and all of the reviews are streamed on UN Web TV. Generally, states under review will have high-level representatives in attendance, which also creates access for CSOs who are in Geneva to high-level representatives to lobby directly on issues. And we have seen actual successes. You should corner Meg so she can tell you about Ireland and stuff. Next slide, please. The UPR does have its weaknesses, and I think one weakness that it has that is similar to all other international spaces is that the recommendations aren't binding. And so there is no overarching accountability mechanism that holds states responsible for non-implementation of their accepted recommendations. So there's generally a weak follow-up mechanism. Also, some states will not accept recommendations that are deemed as controversial or they think will stop them from being elected again. Another issue from our perspective focused on sexual rights is that there are just many SRHR issues that are neglected, while some are just loved and used for virtue signaling. Another weakness is that the UPR really is situated in that web of multilateralism and trade agreements and relations and aid relations and all of those actual international relations related tensions. So there's no way to kind of have like a clean human rights demarcation. Next slide, please. So for the slides, I think you'll have access to the slides afterwards. If you click through on all of the images, you can actually see the different bits of the process. So at the very top left, you can click through and see Canada's last review and hear how the government made their presentation of the national reports and how the different states made their recommendations to the government of Canada. The next image clicks through to the adoption of that advanced and edited version of the report. And then the bottom one links you through to Canada indicating what recommendations it was accepting or not accepting. And then at the bottom right, you can see an example of an oral statement that Action Canada made at Canada's adoption of their third cycle report. So the last time that Canada was reviewed, Canada received 275 recommendations. It supported 208 of them, which is a 75.6-ish acceptance rate, which is higher than the 75.3 average that was present for the third cycle. So not bad, pretty solid. So yeah, next slide, please. So these are some of the SRI's tools. So on the left, we have a toolkit for advocates that are considering using the UPR. It is a little bit dated, but the information is still solid, honest. If you're interested in just learning a little bit more about how you can use the UPR, it'll be very useful. On the right, the image clicks through to our database. So we have a database that collates all of the recommendations that have been received specifically on sexual rights. So it's recommendations, any kinds of mentions of sexual rights in national reports in particular, but also stakeholder reports across all 3 cycles. And as soon as the 4th cycle starts, we will also have the 4th cycle on there. If you're working on issues that are beyond SRHR, there is a pretty good database that is hosted by UPR Info. It's just that it tends to be a little bit behind in terms of what session, it won't be quite as current, but it will have a lot of the other recommendations as well for anybody that's interested. And I think that's the end of my slides.